Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox. Today, again, I will be reading from Final Fantasy and Philosophy. Just because I don't think that there's a lot of people who are interested in this particular philosophical intersection or have picked up this particular, probably kind of niche book. But today we're going to be reading Chapter 12, Human, All Too Human, Cloud's Existential Quest for Authenticity, by Christopher R. Wood. Final Fantasy VII demarcates a rather peculiar place within the historical development of the Final Fantasy series. Putting aside the technological capabilities of the then-new PlayStation console, Final Fantasy VII is known for leaving the first-time gamer with an experience nothing short of profound. The game's complex plot and intertwining side stories culminate in an adventure as entertaining as it is epic, with a lush and diverse world for us to explore at our own pace and by our own will. And while this world, with its high technologies and physics-defying magic, is surely nothing short of fantasy, in the end, the gamer is presented with an experience that, in other ways, mirrors that of our own experience in the not-so-fantastic real world. Much of this is due to the memorable mannerisms of the game's primary characters. As we play through each of the game's 3 discs, we encounter a number of colorful personalities whose hopes, fears, goals, and desires, however diverse, are revealed to be like our own. From an innocent and seemingly simple flower girl living in the slums of a harsh and desolate supercity, to a short-tempered and headstrong man who is, with undying aspirations to become an astronaut, there is nothing tremendously unbelievable about the game's main characters that might prevent us from relating to them on a deep and sympathetic level. All of the game's playable characters are accompanied by a rich backstory that not only explains their involvement contra the malevolent Shinra Corporation, but also, more importantly, helps to drive their actions and aspirations just that much closer to home into the hearts of the game's players. Cloud Strife, Final Fantasy VII's main protagonist, however, comes to us somewhat as more of a mystery. Passive and detached, Cloud tends to speak only when spoken to and rarely offers us anything beyond a series of short, arrogant remarks. Well into the game's first disc, we're told very little about Cloud's history other than his vague childhood ties to Tifa, Lockhart, and his self-proclaimed status as an ex-soldier. And as the game progresses, much of what we learn about him tends to confuse rather than illuminate. Heck, at times, we even have reason to believe that the Cloud we think we know is nothing less than a laboratory-grown creation of the crazed Professor Hojo, a supposition that might help us justify his cold and apathetic attitude. Putting aside the mysteries surrounding Cloud's inception, however, there are ample reasons to argue that the Cloud we come to know is in the end really no different than you or me. Indeed, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, would likely... Man, he died at 56? That's rough. Would likely agree that Cloud is perhaps above every other character in the game, all too human. Cloud's struggle to overcome personal crisis can be interpreted across Nietzschean lines as nothing less than a true expression of the human spirit. From the Midgard train to the world at large, thrown into existence. Existentialist philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, from 1889 until 1973, Jean-Paul Sartre, from 1905 to 1980, wow. Interesting. And the aforementioned Friedrich Nietzsche considered themselves with the trials and tribulations of the everyday existing individual human. Human individual? What? Hold on. I'm going to do this sentence again, but more plainly. Existential philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the aforementioned Friedrich Nietzsche concerned themselves with the trials and tribulations of the everyday existing human individual. Although not all existentialist philosophers share the same views regarding the nature of the human being, most of them agree on a number of undeniable facts of existence common to all individuals. First and foremost, our initial births into the world are never of our own choosing. We are, as Heidegger said so eloquently, thrown into the world with virtually no guidance as to what we should be doing, let alone who we are and what we should strive to become. Just as Cloud is thrown off of Midgar's train into his first mission on Mako Reactor No. 1, we too are thrust into the world of existence without warning. This thrownness, as scary as it may sound, is nevertheless a fundamental part of our very being. We cannot help but find ourselves submerged in a complex world with others, and try as we may, this world is never something from which we can escape. Astronaut jokes aside. To be sure, as Heidegger argued, our connection to the world is not merely a simple relationship between a subject and object. That is, between myself as a person to something out there that exists separate from me. But rather, the world is a complex series of meanings that we find ourselves in at all times. To speak of the human being without reference to his or her world, then, is essentially to commit an error of trying to understand the human individual without looking at what it means to be human in the first place. It is for this very reason that Heidegger often characterized being human as being in the world, and why a distinct understanding of his very intimate connection between an individual and his or her world provides one of the keys to living an authentic life. It should go without saying that the world of Final Fantasy VII tends to hold supreme value to most of the primary characters of the game. The core members of Avalanche, in particular, hold their planet in high regard as the very platform of existence. Indeed, the early missions to destroy Midgar's 8 Mako reactors are carried out on the premise of not only saving human lives, but saving all life in general. For Heidegger, however, the term world was not necessarily synonymous with the planet of Final Fantasy VII. Planet, as we come to learn through Bugenhagen's study of planet life, signifies a distinct living entity with its own life force, a sort of cosmic life that supports and produces all terrestrial life. To Heidegger, the term world is as much of a general import to be understood primarily as that wherein a factorial A factitial human being is said to live. Good lord. Why you gotta make up such a weird word to describe essentially a human being? This distinction, though, has very little bearing on the deep connection between the characters of Final Fantasy VII and their planet, as the death of the latter will most certainly bring about the end of the former. Our earliest in-game experiences with Cloud revealed, however, that the intimate relationship between himself and the world is ultimately of little importance to him. Barrett. Little by little, the reactors will drain out all the life, and that'll be that. Cloud. It's not my problem. Barrett. The planet's dying, Cloud. Cloud. The only thing I care about is finishing this job before security and roboguards come. And later, Tifa. The planet's dying. Slowly but surely it's dying. Someone has to do something. Cloud. So let Barrett and his buddies do something about it. It's got nothing to do with me. It is clear that Cloud's own connection to the world, indeed his connection to the planet as such, is being ignored completely. His only concern, as it would be, to be duly paid for his contribution to Avalanche's bombing missions. Although one might be tempted to ask what value his money might hold in a world without life, it is nevertheless obvious that Cloud, at least initially, is in complete denial of his own existence as a being in the world. But how did Cloud come to such a position? Is he justified in holding such a view? And, perhaps more importantly, can his view change? Is God dead? Nietzschean nihilism and Mako morality. Our initial experience of being thrown into the world at birth is by no means the only cold fact of human existence. Most existentialist philosophers also assert that the human world is, by and large, a godless one, and that the individual human is ultimately alone in the universe. Nietzsche, in particular, is famous for his proclamation that God is dead, and that it just may be time to elect a new leader. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderer of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all the world has bled to death under our knives? What was holiest and most powerful of all the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives? Good Lord. Who will wipe the blood off for us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? It is not the greatness of this deed is too great for us. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it? The passage above is arguably one of Nietzsche's most misunderstood. He is not for one claiming that God once lived in any sort of physical sense, only to have been somehow killed off by his followers. Rather, he is asserting that God has become obsolete and should no longer be recognized as providing us with any sort of real guidance in the modern world. The importance of Nietzsche's proclamation is manifold. First off, it forces individuals to come to terms with their own deep-seated reliance on values that are not their own making. This abrupt realization, Nietzsche thought, would assuredly lead mankind into the state of nihilism. That is, the belief that no objective values are possible and that life as we know it is essentially devoid of meaning. After all, if God is the creator of all values and God is dead, then the foundations of our current values are revealed to be mistaken at best, or completely arbitrary and groundless at worst. The crisis of nihilism, however, is not entirely negative for him. In fact, it is only through our acceptance of God's absence can the individual finally become liberated and learn to create values that are truly his or her own. For so long as we're looking toward an otherworldly God for the solution to our earthly problems, we're turning away from our worldly problems as such. That being said, the death of God ultimately signifies the opportunity for the human individual to re-fulfill the role of God by taking control of his or her own domain and creating values that are purely our own. Of course, one must also be continually aware of the attempts made by others to create a new and equally false God from the rubble of the old, or, in the case of Sephiroth, attempting to achieve godhood itself. The notion of death of God and its accompanying state of nihilism is prevalent throughout Final Fantasy VII. The game's opening cinematic is notable in this regard for portraying a vast and starry sky, sharply contrasted by the hustle and bustle of the streets of Midgar. Through the loud noise of the city, the quiet heiress Gainsborough emerges from an alleyway, and despite her vivid surroundings, we can't help but think of her as being alone in the world. Indeed, her world is one of nihilism. Crime and desolation run rampant in the heart of the city. Very few seem willing to ponder whether a better lifestyle exists, choosing instead to live out their dreary lives much like common cattle confined to their own Mako-powered cages. As Jesse explained shortly after the first mission at the No. 1 reactor, the 8 reactors provide Midgar with electricity. Each town used to have a name, but no one in Midgar remembers them. Instead of names, we refer to them by numbered sectors. That's the kind of place this is. Even Cloud, in what proves to be a rare display of empathy, agrees that Midgar presents us with pretty unsettling scenery, and given what we ourselves see throughout Disc 1, it's difficult to disagree. Jesse and the other members of Barrett's eco-terrorist organization, Avalanche, however, are determined to provide the city, indeed the world as a whole, with a solution to the growing problem that is their modern Mako-powered nihilism. By destroying the world's Mako reactors, Avalanche hopes to liberate humanity from its dependence on the new god of Mako energy, and force people to recognize their own value as inhabitants of a thriving, not to mention endangered, world. Arguably, Barrett and company are calling for the reevaluation of values proposed by Nietzsche and the rebirth of a society founded on self-created values, not on the values that have been forced upon us by the oppressive powers of the Shinra Corporation. Of course, the liberation of mankind and the creation of new values cannot happen solely through the actions of a select few. All people must come to recognize their own capacity for change. Indeed, their own capacity for freedom. Condemned to be free. More than any other existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre highlighted the paradoxical nature of human freedom. Indeed, most of Sartre's existential works can and should be read as descriptions of the effects of absolute freedom might have on the concretely existing human individual. Like Nietzsche, Sartre believed that the individual is born into a world free from the reins of God, and that we as human beings are ultimately left to our own devices, not only in creating values for ourselves, but also in determining what we truly are. For Sartre, this contradiction was best summarized by this statement: existence precedes essence. Unlike common household items or tools that are created by us in order to fulfill a specific role or purpose, human beings are particular insofar as they come into existence without any sort of predetermined essence or reason for being. We can easily conceive of the essence of Cloud's Buster Sword, for example, as an object used to inflict damage on enemies. But when it comes to defining the essence of Cloud himself, the question becomes considerably more difficult for us to answer. Is he a former inhabitant of Nibelheim? A childhood friend of Tifa? An ex-soldier, a member of Avalanche, a sworn enemy of Sephiroth, an impersonator of Zack? What Sartre considered to be our inherent lack of an essence While Sartre considered our inherent lack of essence to be liberating, insofar as it opens up an infinite number of possibilities for us, he also recognized that such a condition can be largely unsettling. The Buster Sword, whose essence is determined in advance of its creation, for example, need not worry about what it is in fact. Indeed, the Buster Sword is just that, a sword, and it will always be a sword until it no longer functions as such. The human individual, however, has no determinate essence and must choose what he or she will become. We may one day choose to become a member of Soldier, as Cloud did in his childhood, or, just as well, we may choose to become a member of Avalanche and fight the malevolent Shinra Corporation instead. In either case, what we become is determined purely by the choices that we make and how we project ourselves towards our freely chosen goals. The catch, of course, is that our freedom is absolute. We cannot escape the fact that we must make our own choices, nor can we have anyone choose for us in our place. Even choosing not to choose is a choice in itself. As one might imagine, this absolute freedom can be quite cumbersome at times. So long as we are living in a world without a God-determined essence, we have no choice but to act according to our own free will and by our free will alone. Because of this, we are held completely responsible for our actions with no exceptions. If we perform an act that we later decide to be reprehensible, such as the destruction of an entire sector of Midgar, citizens included, we have no one to blame for it but ourselves. In such a case, I could not truthfully say that God created me in order to perform such a terrible act, because I, as a free being whose existence precedes his essence, am always free to choose otherwise, namely, to refuse to carry out the destructive act. Cloud is of course no exception to this rule. He must, nearly at every turn, choose which course of action to take, as well as we, as the game's players, must guide him along the way. In encountering Eris for the first time, we can, for example, choose to address her or ignore her concerns. Similarly, we can choose to buy a flower from her or instead tell her to forget it. We cannot, however, avoid making these choices altogether. In fact, as we come to learn later on, the choices we do make, in part, determine how we are perceived by others. If we choose to treat Eris poorly, we should not be surprised that she does not show up as Cloud's late-night date in Gold Saucer on Disc 1. Of course, while there are times in which we might want to escape the consequences of our choices, it would appear that in reality it is not possible for us to do so. Indeed, we are, as Sartre himself would say, condemned to be free, and must, as a result, accept the responsibilities that accompanies our absolute freedom. The bad faith of soldier. Although it is true that human individuality is necessarily free, Sartre contended that we often attempt to deny our own freedom through various means. We might, for example, pretend that we are people whose jobs or roles in society completely determine the choices that we make, and as a result, we could not choose otherwise. A weapons salesman, for example, might excuse his cowardice in times of war on the grounds that he is simply a salesman, and that it is not his salesman nature to participate in the actual acts of combat. Of course, in reality, the salesman isn't only just that. He could at any time choose to arm himself with his own wares and fend off the waves of oncoming monsters, and whether he would be wise to do this is, of course, another matter altogether. What's interesting to note about these personal cover-ups, however, is that we as human beings have the particular capacity to actually believe them ourselves. Unlike blatant lies in which the liar fully understands that he is being dishonest, acts of self-deception, Sartre contended, call for the liar to dupe themselves. Sartre explained the phenomenon by describing the motions of a particular waiter in a cafe. Let us consider this waiter in the cafe. His movement is too quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He comes towards the patrons with a step a little too quick. He bends forward a little too eagerly. His voice, his eyes express an interest a little too solicitous for the order of the customer. He is playing, he is amusing himself, but what is he playing? We need not watch long before we can explain it. He is playing being a waiter in a cafe. The key word here is really being. The waiter's rigid movements are not merely an attempt at imitating the characteristics that one might find present in a perfect waiter. More fundamentally, his attempt is that of passing himself off as completely as something that he is not. To be sure, the waiter is not merely a waiter. He has a life outside of the cafe, complete with his own hobbies, interests, and desires, at least we would hope. Nevertheless, he has chosen to portray himself as some sort of waiter-like robot by ignoring everything that's irrelevant to being a waiter and by adopting a series of actions that are clearly not natural to him. But worst of all, he believes that he can actually pull it off. This belief that it might actually be possible for us to sever our ties with freedom and act as though we are not actually responsible for our own actions is called bad faith. And that was considered by Sartre to be a mode of inauthentic being that is all too common in each of our lives, and the lives of Final Fantasy VII being no exception. Consider the case of Cloud. In his initial appearances, he portrays himself as a cold and arrogant mercenary whose only care is to be reimbursed for his contributions to Avalanche. His responses to others are short and to the point. He has no apparent desire to go beyond what is strictly required of him. His oversized Buster Sword, perhaps a little bit too large for his comparatively small frame, is displayed with pride, and his uniform, while matching that of his enemy, is worn without shame. When asked for his opinion, or in times of when others might express theirs, he is quick to disclose that such matters are insignificant to him, and that the only matter of relevance is the hefty sum of gil at the end of the day. But what can we say to this? Well, to Sartre, the answer is clear. Cloud is playing at being a soldier. Inauthenticity and the life of the mercenary. Existentialist philosophers such as Sartre, Heidegger, and Nietzsche would all agree that not only is the human life solely what we make of it, but that what we make of it can also be determined by our own free choices and actions. They also tend to argue that the choices that we do make will inevitably lead us down one of two possible paths in life. The authentic path, marked by the acceptance of the factical conditions of existence and the will to perpetually create new values, and the inauthentic path, marked by the denial of human freedom and the adherence to faulty or stagnant values. Authentic individuals thus possess a strong degree of self-mastery and creativity, whereas inauthentic individuals wallow in slavishness, seeking largely to relieve themselves of the weight of their own responsibilities. The evolution of Cloud's story is of particular interest in this regard, as the choices that Cloud makes seem to carry him from one extreme to the other. Indeed, one might even go so far as to say that Cloud's quest in Final Fantasy VII is not so much one to save the world, but rather to come to terms with the coherence of his own role within it. To begin, his earliest incarnation, shown to us in the livestream flashbacks in the destruction of Mideel in Disc 2, we find a young Cloud yearning for attention and acceptance in the world. Cloud: I really wanted to play with everyone, but I was never allowed into the group. Then later, Cloud: I began to think I was different, that I might be different from those immature kids, that then maybe, just maybe, they would invite me in. I thought that might happen, so I hung around. I was so prejudiced and weak. Of course, as we know, Cloud never won acceptance into Tifa's childhood gang. The open possibilities of the world, however, soon provide him with new opportunities to prove to Tifa that he is not as weak as others think. Cloud: Come this spring, I'm leaving town for Midgar. Tifa: All the boys are leaving our town. Cloud: But I'm different from all of them. I'm not gonna just find a job. I want to join Soldier. I'm gonna be the best there is. Just like Sephiroth. While Cloud's boyhood dream could perhaps be passed off as just that, his decision to pursue a career in Soldier would ultimately prove to be life-changing. One might even liken this event to the Nietzschean death of God for Cloud, insofar as it marks the adoption of a radical new set of values. Indeed, in these latter stages of his childhood, Cloud comes to the realization that the values of his youth that had been bestowed upon him by his community have essentially become obsolete. His attempts to fit in with his peers by being himself have failed. He finds himself left only to his own devices in the breadth of the open world. The decision to climb the ranks into soldierhood would seem to offer the potential solution to his growing nihilism. But in the same decision also lurks the danger of growing further away from his goal of true independence. Unfortunately, Cloud's choice seems to have led him down the latter path. In the first half of the game, Cloud comports himself wholly as if he has succeeded in rising up the ranks to the first class of soldier. Even in his own memories, as disclosed to us in the early flashback scene in Calm in Disc 1, portrays him as having fought side by side with Sephiroth against the dangerous monsters of Mount Nebel. What we learn in the second half, though, is a completely different story. Cloud never became a first-class soldier. In fact, Cloud never joined Soldier at all. As we learn in the livestream flashback scenes in Disc 2, his service to Shinra's military forces never went beyond that of a common guard. Cloud: I never made it as a member of Soldier. I even left my hometown telling everyone that I was going to join, but I was so embarrassed I didn't want to see anybody. And by this, the truth is revealed. Cloud's initial tough guy attitude of this game's first half was never of his own making, but rather was adopted entirely through his own conception of what a first-class soldier should be. In the optional Shinra Mansion flashback sequence of Disc 3, we learn that Cloud's idea to work as a mercenary in Midgar, as well as his soldier uniform and his characteristic Buster sword, all belonged to Zack, Aeris's then boyfriend and a true first-class soldier. Zack: Listen, I'm gonna become a mercenary and that's that. Boring stuff, dangerous stuff, anything for money. I'm gonna be rich. Cloud, what are you going to do? Having just escaped his Mako containment chamber in the mansion's basement laboratory and seemingly unable or unwilling to respond, Cloud remained silent in contrast to Zack's excitement, leaving Zack to choose his future for him. Zack, mercenaries, Cloud. That's what you and me are gonna be. As we find out later, however, Zack never gets to live out his dream and is quickly shot down by Shinra guards on his arrival at Midgar. Cloud, however, appearing in a near-dead state, survives the onslaught unscathed, and after waking up from the events that transpired, he claims Zack's sword as his own, as well as Zack's dream of a mercenary life as his own. From soldier to savior, Cloud's turn to authenticity. The Cloud of the game's first half is, without a doubt, a Cloud living in bad faith. His choice to leave Nibelheim was a choice made on the grounds of trying to become something that he is not, namely, a person of great strength who is respected for his high standing and status among Shinra's military elite. Of course, the Cloud we eventually come to know possesses neither of these two features. He is merely an ordinary person seeking his own path in the world. Perhaps no different in this regard from you or me. Unfortunately, rather than abiding by his own free will and working to create his own values, Cloud chooses instead to take the inauthentic route and adopt a persona that's already well established, a persona that he believes will readily propel him into a position of respect and admiration. These mistakes, however, are not entirely unrecoverable. Cloud, as a free human being, is endowed with the capacity to choose otherwise and, specifically, to make the choice to change his ways. And although we may have reason to believe that Cloud's exposure to Mako radiation is detrimental to his ability to function autonomously, his willingness to face the darkness of his past at the start of the second half of the game is a strong indication of his desire to start anew. Indeed, to start life authentically. After Cloud and Tifa wake up from their submergence in the livestream after the attacks on Mediel in Disc 2, Tifa finds herself, by whatever means, capable of entering Cloud's mind and following him through the depths of his own memories. Together, they revisit the fateful mission at Mount Nebel as it frequently appears in the game's earlier scenes. It is here that Cloud, by his own free will, is able to come to terms with the inauthenticity of his past and ultimately give new meaning to his future. We learn, first off, that Cloud's boyhood weakness and desire to impress Tifa were indeed his primary reasons for pursuing a career as soldier. Cloud. I was so angry. Angry at myself about my weakness. That was the first time that I heard about Sephiroth. If I could be strong like Sephiroth, then everyone might. If I could get stronger, then even Tifa would have to notice me. Second, in the same episode, we affirmed that Cloud never did partake in the Nebel mission as a soldier. Instead, he found himself too embarrassed by his own lies of soldierdom that he chose to hide his face from his hometown by wearing an uncomfortable guard's mask for the duration of the mission. Third, and perhaps most important, we learned that although he considered himself weak and cowardly, it was Cloud, and not Zack, who mustered up the strength and courage necessary to stop Sephiroth by throwing him into the Mako reactor at Mount Nebel, effectively preventing, or at least delaying, his terrible spree to destroy the planet. Indeed, although Cloud had hitherto lived his entire life in an inauthentic state of perpetual bad faith after coming to terms with his own failures, as well as realizing his own strength as a free individual fully capable of vanquishing the powerful Sephiroth, Cloud awakens from his stupor and returns to his friends with new hope. At this point, we see Cloud encounter... At this point, the Cloud we encounter seems wholly transformed. Cloud. I was never in Soldier. I made up those stories about what happened to me 5 years ago about being in Soldier. I left my village looking for glory, but I never made it into Soldier. I was so ashamed of being weak. Then I heard this story from my friend Zack, and I created an illusion of myself made up of what I had seen in my life. And I continued to play the charade as if it were true. Barrett. Illusion, huh? Pretty damn strong for an illusion, I'd say. This noble admittance to having chosen the inauthentic path in life is soon followed by the decision to live life to its fullest, with all of its hiccups and flaws. Cloud. I'm Cloud, the master of my own illusionary world, but I can't remain trapped in an illusion anymore. I'm going to live my life without pretending. With that, Cloud vows to carry onward with Avalanche's original mission to protect the planet at all costs, and to defeat Sephiroth once and for all. For it is at this point that he has come to the realization that the world is indeed an integral part of his very being, and that regardless of his futile attempts to deny the conditions of his own existence, he will always be fully responsible for his own actions, and, consequently, the true master of his own destiny. Cloud's choice and ours. As we have seen, the story of Final Fantasy VII is wrought with numerous existentialist themes. As players of the game, we find ourselves thrown into a godless world of modern nihilism and must, through no avenue other than the free choices and, of course, with our controllers in hand, come to terms with our place in it, our relationships with others, and perhaps most important, ourselves. Through the perspective of Cloud Strife in particular, we experience a wide array of life choices and address their consequences with a depth of character that is not typical in other games. Indeed, the choices that Cloud makes not only illustrate the breadth of the human spirit, but also demonstrate our capability as individuals to actualize our potential through the realization of our own freedom and responsibilities. And while these realizations ultimately enable Cloud to save the planet from its gravest dangers, they also afford him the opportunity to complete the most fundamental quest of all, to live life authentically. The notes from this chapter, particularly observant players of Final Fantasy VII might recall that the name Heidegger is also shared by the head of Shinra's Public Safety Maintenance Department. There is little reason to believe, however, in any significant connection between the two. At least through philosophy. I think there might be a little bit of a connection, like a meta connection with his life, but not. It's not representative. It's not representative of his philosophy, and it's also not like a mirror of his philosophy like we see in a lot of the themes, philosophical themes within Nier Automata either. It's just kind of strange. The second reference is from Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, written in 1962. The third is Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science. Wait, what? Written in 1982. So that's probably a more modern gay. What? Okay, Nietzsche. Note 4 is that the female company who accompanies Cloud for this particular event is determined by how the player responds to dialogue with these characters, and B, how often the character is placed in the same party with Cloud. If all female characters are treated especially poorly or neglected by the player, Barrett will show up for the date instead. And the fifth reference was John Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, released in 1992. Wow, okay, so, bam. That was probably the biggest chapter that I've done so far, and also probably the most relevant to modern concerns. One of the things that I really love about the philosophy of Final Fantasy is that there's a lot of attempts to tackle concepts of nihilism and postmodernism. And we live in kind of a world that tends to bounce between postmodernism and nihilism. And despite what political rhetoric may tell you, I don't think anybody is particularly happy with either of those two states of being. Everyone is trying to transcend that. It's not something like nihilism isn't being forced upon you by the right. Postmodernism isn't being forced upon you by the left. And the inverse of those two things aren't true either. I don't think anyone cares for either of these things, really. Except for edgy fascists who are actually kind of into Nietzsche unironically sometimes. Because they love the idea of the Übermensch, because they're completely misunderstanding what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch. But anyways, that is probably for a whole nother chapter. Is Sephiroth the Ubermensch? No. Definitely not. Not by Nietzsche's a definition of that, I don't believe. But I think the way a lot of people interpret it, he would be, which is real fucking troubling. But anyways, tell me if you enjoyed this. I do still have plenty more chapters of this book that I could read. I personally find this a lot more fascinating and a bit less dry than straight philosophy. This gets you a little bit of a Final Fantasy mixer in there. Maybe the next one that I'll do, second chapter, Kafka, Nietzsche, and Foucault. Madness and Nihilism in Final Fantasy VI. I think that would be a really fun one. But I've named some of the chapters in previous videos. I'm not going to read them at the end of every one of these, but that is one of the ones that I think would be interesting, personally. Final Fantasy and the Purpose of Life might be a good one. The 4 Warriors of Light saved the world, but they don't deserve our thanks. That might be a little bit of a clickbait title, but it is really interesting to think about. Or maybe the objectification of conscious life forms in Final Fantasy. Like Final Fantasy 1, I guess. But maybe Final Fantasy in general. But hey, if you liked it, like it, subscribe, do the things. Join my Discord, which is... This is like an intersection of my 2 channels in that it's got some Final Fantasy, some gaming, and philosophy all as well. And if you like that intersection, you might like my Discord, so check that out. I think it's in my description by now. So, take a look, join up. The part of the server that's going to be more oriented towards this is going to be, I believe, the friends side. So when you go into the Get Roles section, hit the friends, and there's going to be a whole lot of stuff related to this channel. Just a general political forum as well for people who need to vent about world topics. And also, since I'm trying to build a bit of a global community here, so it's not just Americans talking with Americans about American things, and also to help cultivate my own global perspective, I am hoping that people from all around the world who are interested in these sorts of things will also join us and be able to give us an inside perspective on the places that they live, and what is news there, and what is happening there. To kind of, bypass the news cycle a little bit and what we are told we should listen to, and instead listen to people from those places instead. So if you like that, there's going to be links in the description. You can also support the channel. It'd be nice, like, hey, send me some money on coffee or something, just to pay me back for the book or something if you appreciate me reading it out to you. I will probably work through this to the point where I will eventually have a playlist where you just have an audiobook of me reading this to you, with maybe these little outros in between each chapter. But, hey, let me know what you thought of this in the comments, because I'm really curious to know what you guys think about some of the ways that this is presented. I think that this book is really fascinating. I usually agree with the gamer stuff, like the lore stuff that they get into. It's really good. Like, these guys really care about the subject material that they're talking about. I'm not as fluent on some of the philosophy here, so if you are more fluent in the philosophy on that and you want to kind of correct some of the incorrectnesses that may have been in some of these chapters, well, yeah, let me know what you think. Like, do you disagree? Do you agree? Do you have a different take on the game? Like, just let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.